Welcome to Beer and Iron's the perfect beer broth for soups, stews, and chilies. First of all, how y'all doing? It's good to see each and every one of y'all. The backbone to any soup, stew, or chili is the broth that you use. If the broth is flavorful, so will the soup, stew, or chili. Let's make this. You see here, carrot peelings, cabbage trimmings, onion trimmings, broccoli stumps. They're all edible, but we still toss them while we're cutting and trimming and chopping for our recipes. But I think we should hold on to them. And like vegetable trimmings, we'll end up with bones, skin, fat, and giblet treasures after we have finished brining, roasting, and deboning chicken. Every bit of this has the potential to create a wonderful, full-bodied broth that will change your soup, stews, and chilies forevermore. We will save a week's worth of vegetable trimmings in the refrigerator and freeze our meat scraps until we've saved enough to create this broth. You can create this broth in a large cast iron Dutch oven, or if you don't have a nice 9-quart like this one, there's a link in the description to get your very own. You can use a large stainless steel sauce pot. Stainless. Wash my mouth out. We'll start with the chicken parts. I think they're the most important part of this cook. All them bones and tendons and collagen-heavy parts and pieces will create the broth with a body and a flavor. There's a lot of airspace there and plenty of room for those vegetable parts. And don't worry if it looks too full in that pot. All that space will break down and the liquid itself will boil down too. There's plenty of room. Just keep going. We've got carrot peelings, cabbage parts, endive leaves, stems from parsley, broccoli trunks, pepper placentas. Just cram it in. And unless you have another use for them giblets, add them as well. Beer, of course, is another key ingredient in this recipe. It's going to take quite a few of these to get the liquid up to the level where we need it. Now, you may be asking, will it taste like beer? It's a good question indeed, and no, it will not taste like beer. Now look at here, I bought this little cast iron fish off eBay about 10 years ago. I can't tell you how many bottles of beer it's cracked open for us. Stick with a beer that's generally considered well balanced and with only a light hop character that would, if you were going to drink it, have a crisp, clean finish. How many beers are you going to need for this cook? Well, that depends on two things. Number one, how big is your cast iron pot? In theory, this 9-quart Dutch oven can hold 24 12-ounce beers, but we're not going to need near that many for this broth cook. The next thing is how much ingredients are you adding to that pot? More ingredients means less beer, less room for beer. The beauty of this recipe is, if you've added all the beers that you want to add, or all the beers you have, then you can add a bit of water or broth from a box to bring the liquid level up to the level that you want. We don't want the liquid to be all the way to the top. Those vegetables and chicken parts have moisture in them already, and that moisture will render out and into our broth along with the flavors. We also need some headspace to be able to turn and mix everything as we cook this recipe and as the ingredients soften up. This batch is going to reduce some. You'll see that as we go along. Did you see how high the level of stacked ingredients dropped as the liquid level rose? We're just simmering this. Put your heat on medium to get the simmering started. Then once the simmering is started, turn it down to low or medium low for the duration. Once things get low enough, go ahead and give everything a good turning. Looking pretty full, don't it? No worries, it'll reduce soon enough. Just keep watching. Those ingredients are still looking pretty fresh. Soon they'll start to wilt as they break down. The height of the ingredients will start to collapse. At first, you'll stir it every once in a while. Then later, you'll just let it simmer and let it do its thing. We'll cook this for about an hour to 3 hours, maybe longer if we need to. See? Even the chicken bones are starting to break down. Look at that. Keep an eye on that liquid level in that pot. Watch how it reduces down. And look at here at the keel bone cartilage. That's there toward the middle of the screen at the bottom. It's that triangle cartilage at the chicken's breast. Keep an eye on that. You can cover this pot if you want. I would suggest doing so. Leave a small space for the steam to escape. This way the liquid will simmer, but things will not get too hot and create a rolling boil. We just want to simmer. Now it's starting to look like a gigantic pot of stew. That's the thing about these parts and pieces we usually toss. They're the same ingredients that we use in our meals throughout the week, but they are rough and tough, and they'd be hard to eat. But it don't mean they ain't got flavor and nutrition. Look at here, a lot different now. Things are starting to break down and break apart. The only thing that's still intact are those tough broccoli trunks. Did you know we actually use most of the trunk of broccoli to stir fry? I'll show you one day. And hey, if you want to see how we use those broccoli stems in our cooking, and if you're liking this video thus far, considering giving us a little like by hitting that little thumb, selecting subscribe, and don't forget to hit that little dinner bell. At this point, there's nothing really identifiable, just a bunch of bones and overcooked vegetables, just like what we're shooting for. Look at those small bones. They are now all missing their joints and connective tissues. That's all been blended into the broth. Do you see that breastbone? The keel bone cartilage has broke free, but the rough and tough broccoli trunk is holding its own. Trust me, it's given up to that broth too, no worries. Once the broth has cooked down a bit and you're ready to start separating the solids from the liquid, remove the pot from the heat and let it cool for just a bit. Not long, just a bit. We let this broth cook for about 3 hours. You can see the difference here in the way it started and the way it is now. We have some canning jars at the ready. This is not a canning recipe. We're using these jars to store the broth in the refrigerator. We separate the broth from the meat, bones, and vegetable parts. The pot is going to be cool enough to the touch. We're going to check it by tapping it. Set a metal strainer in a bowl that can handle the heat of the broth. Then we know we're ready. You could just pour the broth through, but that broth is still pretty hot and that pot is heavy. Pouring it will often require being poured towards you, and as those ingredients shift, it may spill or splatter at you as you turn it to pour into that colander. My suggestion is to use a ladle, a small coffee cup, or a smaller Pyrex container to transfer the broth to the strainer. Now we're going to ladle it over bit by bit. It lets the broth drain better. Once you've got a little bit of the ingredients in there, just stir it a bit in that strainer and let it drain. Now this is the broth we're looking for. It's perfect. Deep color, a bit of fat on top, and tiny bits and pieces that have made it through that strainer. We want all of that. Now place the strainer back on the bowl and keep on ladling. We're going to work this down to a manageable amount, and then we're going to pour it over. There are some meat parts in there, and I have been known to remove the meat parts with attention to detail to avoid adding tiny bones. If I have created my broth with ingredients that are not considered harmful to dogs, I'll pick out some of that meat and cartilage parts to create biscuits for our pups. And yes, I have an article and a video on that process from when we made beef bone broth. This is all a bit messy, but it's going to be totally worth it with the end result. Eventually, you're going to reach a point where you start to realize the ladle is not effective any longer, and your broth amount is more manageable enough to pour over. If your pot is too heavy for you, have someone give you a hand. We're using a 9-quart from Lodge. Lodge says this pot weighs 19.75 pounds. My shoulder begs the differ, and that's proof as I try to hold this up with one arm and scoop the ingredients out with the other. But I'm sure they're telling the truth. Just finish stirring and mashing the stuff in the strainer to get as much of the broth out as you can from those cooked ingredients. Once you have it all separated, set your jars on a heat-safe surface. I suggest using wide-mouth jars and a canning funnel. You're going to make a mess here. Then again, my wife reminds me that I'm genetically prone to mess creation. She has described my congenital chromosomal defect as being related to the Y chromosome, and so she forgives me when I make a mess, as long as I clean it up later. Pour the broth over into each jar, one by one, until you have it all transferred. You can use metal canning jar lids here, but I prefer these plastic ones. They are dishwashable and reusable. Do you see that? The broth has layers. There's a bit of fat on top, some floating bits and pieces under that, and then the body of the broth occupying the majority of the jar. 2.5 quarts is about what we expect here. Doesn't seem like much, does it? But keep the perspective. We created this broth from the trash parts of prepared ingredients from other recipes. And when we create a gumbo, chicken stew, or even a hamburger soup in a 5-quart Dutch oven, you'll likely only need one of these jars for any one of those recipes. What we have here is likely enough for 2 or 3 recipes. And during the week, when you create those 2 to 3 meals, you'll produce scraps and cuttings that we'll save for the next time we create broth. It's a cycle we try to maintain. Refrigerate this broth for a period of time. How long? Well, that's up to you. My suggestion is to use it up before you start wondering if it's still good. For us, it seldom stays in the refrigerator for more than a week or 2. This is what it looks like after it's been cooled in the refrigerator. That top part is not all fat. Sometimes the fat will solidify at the top. We call that the fat cap. Other times the fat will just remain oil-like. We use that fat. We use it to create roux, and we'll also use it to saute other ingredients when we're making other soups and stews. Don't throw that stuff away. It's a flavor bomb. Now watch as I turn these jars. Do you see that gel-like movement in that broth? It'll have the consistency of Jell-O or even egg custard. I'm telling you, that fat there on top makes the best roux ever. And that's about it, y'all. Thanks for watching. I hope this video was worthy of a thumbs up and a subscribe, as well as a little ding on that notification dinner bell. I sure do appreciate y'all watching this video. My name is Sule, and I love to share the magic that comes out of my black pots and pans. I want to know what y'all all think about this recipe and creating broth this way. And give me some ideas. What recipes do you use your broth in? Well, that's it. You all take care and keep on cooking in those cast iron beauties. And keep on enjoying those frosted glasses full of that fermented barley pop. We'll see y'all next time on beerandIron.com.